computer, and then I can make it.
All right.
And so you can see here it's recording.
Okay, so it is recording now.
Okay, we can start.
All right. Go ahead, Eric.
Boker Tov, everyone. We are thrilled to invite this morning our in-house scholar and resident of many, many topics. But this morning's topic is the impact of the recent American and Israeli elections on the American-Israeli relationship. And we want to thank the CBS Brotherhood for sponsoring the talk this morning. And without further ado, thank you, Dr. Steckler, for your research and information this morning.
Thank you. Okay, well, there were 4 elections either have just occurred or will occur, which will determine the fate of the Middle East. The first was the Biden election in November, and Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and Iran all need to interact with this election. Now, in terms of the Israeli election, this was the 4th in 2 years in March 2021. And right now there's a stalemate between the pro-Bibi forces versus the anti-Bibi forces. And you may say, unlike the US, it's not the left versus the right. It's more the right center versus the right. The left in Israel has diminished remarkably since the second Intifada. Netanyahu has gotten the first attempt to form a coalition, and then he has about another 2 weeks, and the whole process is like making sausage. You really don't want to see how it's done. If he doesn't get the required 61 votes, then the other forces may get their attempt. But there's actually been a breakthrough in Israeli politics with Mansour Abbas from the Ra'am party. It's from the Southern Islamicist party. Netanyahu actually reached out to him to be part of the coalition. It probably won't happen, but it really broke the taboo about Arab parties involved in the government. It may not happen this time, but it's something that will be a part of the political equation going forward. There's been a couple of consequences of the stalemate in Israel. One, the COVID committee cannot buy more Pfizer vaccines because of dispute between Gantz and Netanyahu about appointing a justice minister. And so right now, Pfizer has been pretty pissed about that. Hopefully that will be resolved soon. They still have about 500,000 to 1 million doses. And there is whoever is elected eventually, either now or hopefully not a 5th election, there'll be a number of issues that the government will need to face with the new administration. You know, Biden had made clear he's against building an annexation in the West Bank, which by itself is probably not a problem because all the major parties have agreed that the Abraham Accords probably takes precedent over any form of annexation. But one issue that wasn't resolved was East Jerusalem. And there's plans for more building in the Har Homa neighborhood in southern Jerusalem. And that may be an issue that will need to be contended with. Also, another main issue will be with China. You know, obviously, where China has been becoming a strategic adversary to the United States. And China has been an important economic partner of Israel, with a great deal of investment, particularly in technology and other dual purpose issues and artificial intelligence. And there's been a good deal of pressure by the US to curtail that relationship. The Israelis have formed an oversight committee to look at deals, but there's been issues with the Haifa port. The Israelis did back away from a Chinese bid on a new desalinization plant. And probably what will end up happening is The United Arab Emirates are going to be having more investment in Israel. We've already seen more investment from Korea and Japan in Israel, and there'll probably be more creative waves of the US investing in particularly Israeli technology to probably cut down on the influence of China in the future. But this is probably going to be one of the major issues between the new administration. It would have been the same with the Trump administration and whoever is prime minister in Israel. Now, in terms of the Palestinians, their parliamentary elections are on May 22nd, and the presidential elections are July 31st. It's unclear whether Abbas, who's 85, will run. You know, his 4-year term really ended in 2009. And the last Palestinian parliamentary elections have been 2006. If the US had wanted to give $75 million to basically to NGOs to bolster the Palestinian Authority in multiple points for the election. Problem is, one is the Taylor-Forst Act, which prohibits aid to the Palestinians as long as they're giving monies to terrorists and their families. And even though the US said, well, we're giving it to NGOs, not directly to the Palestinian Authority, a recent General Accounting Office said that, well, yes, you can give to the NGOs, but once it goes from there, we really don't have a good idea who's getting the money after that. And right now, the Republicans in the House and Senate are holding up this money. Part of it is money is fungible. If you give money for one thing, you can use it for something else. And also, apparently, there's been no quid pro quo, because the Palestinians have been pushing the International Criminal Court against Israel. We really said nothing about that to give the money, or there's been a great deal of repression of civil society in the Palestinian Authority, and we really didn't make any of the money contingent on that. Also, 150 million has been given to the UN Relief and Works Agency, which is, even though probably 40 to 200,000 people are original refugees, because UNRWA is unique in counting all descendants of refugees, is actually up to 5.7 million. The administration said, well, he has assurances that there's no anti-Semitism in the textbooks, which is really not believable. Actually, Hadassah, the ADL, ZOA, and others have circulating a letter for senators to sign to send to the UN head to look into reform the school system. Another major issue is for the election that Fatah is splintering. They have at least 3 slates. There's also Hamas and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and others are running who have terrorist designations even in the US. And there's actually a bill that had been passed in 2006. Biden was a co-sponsor that no aid to the Palestinian Authority if terrorist organizations are in the government, and it's also in the Oslo Accords. One way out of this is Abbas says that, well, there'll be no elections with East Jerusalem Arabs not counted. And that may be a way to get out of the elections. And it looks like now that the US may be getting cold feet on the elections because they're worried about Hamas either winning or being part of the government, which for any near future would destroy any chance for a two-states solution. When you get to Iran, right now there's meetings in Vienna with the Europeans, the Chinese, and the Russians to see if we can, and the US is only indirectly involved. Robert Malley, who's head of the Iran desk, is in Vienna, and it's sort of like shuttle diplomacy. The aim for the Biden administration is to go back to the JCPOA for basically sanction relief or rollback of Iranian enrichments above the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action commitments. And one, it's not that easy to do because the sanctions are not only on the nuclear program, they're also for terrorism and human rights. For instance, the Revolutionary Guard and the central bank have been targeted for terrorism, supporting terrorism. And it would be a major political issue if you try to remove, say, the Revolutionary Guard because, from the terrorism list. And there's also skepticism in Congress, not only Republicans, but also more hawkish Democrats. I mean, the administration's idea is, well, we'll go back to the JCPOA. It'll give us a pause button so we can deal with other things like COVID, the economy, and China. And then we'll use the threat of snapback sanctions to get them to deal, to have a better deal. Well, there's problems with that. One, it'll probably take over a year, even if they get some sort of agreement, to fully go back to the JCPOA. And in 2023, there's already the sunset clauses of ballistic missiles expire. And in 2025, you have the sunset on centrifuges. And the other is, you know, what you're looking at now with all these violations by Iran in terms of enrichment, advanced centrifuges, metallization of uranium. Well, all of that becomes legal in the future. Once the sanctions, the sunset clauses start expiring. And also Iran would need to, what we want is to scale back the nuclear program, the hegemony in the Middle East, and ballistic missiles. And it's unlikely the Revolutionary Guard would agree to any of those. And also, the most likely course of action for the Iranians would be for at least to 2025, to stay scrupulously to the Iran deal. And it would be highly unlikely that the Europeans, the Chinese, and the Russians would agree to snap back sanctions. And so the idea, well, we'll do step one and then go on to step two, it may not be a feasible thing. Also, as part of the deal, the Iranians would have to show what the prior dimensions of the nuclear program. And right now they're actually stonewalling the International Atomic Energy Commission on about uranium particles that were found at 2 sites that came from the Mossad operation in Tehran in 2018. And they've been stonewalling that. Now, in Iran, there's also presidential elections in June of 2018. Even though what you hear in the newspapers, it's moderate versus hardliners, it's really hardliners versus harder liners in Iran. Remember, under the so-called moderates now, like Zarif and Rouhani, you've had increases of their proxies attacks in Syria, Iraq, in Yemen. You've had the increase of their nuclear program. And it's very likely that the harder liners associated with the Revolutionary Guard will win in June. And they already control probably close to 50% of the 30 to 40 to 50% of the Iranian economy. Particularly, they control the nuclear program, ballistic missiles, heavy industry. The other thing is Khamenei is 85 years old. He's in poor health. And it basically, the Revolutionary Guard, who's the most anti-Israel and anti-US, will most likely be the kingmaker for the next supreme leader. Now, at the negotiations now, thanks to the maximum pressure campaign, the US has at least a good deal of leverage because of the economic hardships in Iran, decreased funding of proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas. I mean, I think one of the reasons that the maximum pressure campaign didn't lead to a collapse of the Iranians before the election in the United States is the Iranians were waiting to see who would win, because they knew that Biden would most likely go on, they'd get a better deal with Biden than Trump. So they were hedging their bets and waiting to see who would win. You know, also the US probably does get some more leverage with the recent explosions at Natanz with the electrical system underground in Natanz. You know, these systems were about 40 meters below ground. And it did damage, even the Iranians say, a lot of the centrifuges. This was after a day before the Iranians said they're ramping up, you know, enrichment of 20% uranium. One thing that's important to note, the Iranians are actually far away, even for 20% uranium for a bomb. For 20%, to get enough, say 20% uranium to be enriched to 90%, you need about 250 kilograms. They only have about 55 kilograms now, a long way you know, from even getting close to have enough for one bomb right now. So what did the Iranians do? Well, they said they're enriching now above ground at Natanz to 60%, which is truthfully the difference between enriching to 20 to 60 and 20 to 90 is actually very little. And right now it's probably of only symbolic value because they're actually making only very tiny amounts of 60%. It's more to try to get leverage at the negotiations than a real push to quickly get to the bomb. The other leverage which Iran at least thinks they have is they have a 25-year deal with China for $400 billion. And the Chinese have been ramping up purchases of oil in Iran, but some of this may be aspirational and not real. It may never take place. And there's actually a good deal of pushback in Iran in certain quarters because the Iranians don't want to give up their sovereignty, or at least parts of their sovereignty, to the Iranians. And in fact, China has more trade with the Saudis and the Emirates than they do with Iran, even though China is the biggest trading partner of Iran. They have other interests involved. Now, in terms of Israel, Netanyahu says we're not bound by any agreement on the JCPOA. Others have spoken out, like Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi and the IDF Chief of Staff Aviv Kochavi, the same thing, that we're not going to abide by any agreements. And why? For the United States and Europe, Iran is a threat, something to be dealt with, but it's not an existential threat like it is to Israel. And I think that perspective is important. You know, there's been reports that the Biden administration wants Israel to be less outspoken. Others, even in Israel, think, well, part of it may be political, that they're ramping up the talk against going back to the JCPOA. But I think Netanyahu has a long history of opposing the Iran deal, as you saw during the Obama administration. And I think he considers himself uniquely qualified to deal with that issue for his country. What I think the Israelis would like to see, and there was a letter from United Against a Nuclear Iran, which I think gives pretty well the Israeli opinion. It would be no re-entry into the JCPOA, no sanction relief just for negotiations, zero enrichment or reprocessing, full inspections and verification, because right now the Iranians do not let anyone inspect any military sites. And it's precisely military sites. If you're ever going to have a push to develop a bomb, that's where it would be. You have to resolve the undeclared nuclear actions, because if you don't have a denominator and know where they've been, the Iranians, you really don't know how quickly they can get to a bomb. And you need to have this bipartisan, and truthfully, the best way would be if there is ever any agreement as a treaty, because then it has the force of law, while the JCPOA is actually essentially an executive action, and the next president can reverse whatever is decided now. And you also have to have a realistic military option, either by the US or Israel or both, to get, essentially for the US to get what you want. You know, the US and Israel have been having ongoing discussions. There was a recent Zoom meeting, the second, between Mir Ben Shabbat, who is the Israeli National Security Advisor, with Jake Sullivan, who's the US counterpart. And Yossi Cohen, who's the head of the Mossad, is going to the US soon to present evidence of the clandestine activity, nuclear activities of Iran, and he hopes to meet with the president. You know, General Lloyd Austin, who's now the Secretary of Defense, went to Israel and met with Defense Minister Gantz, and there seems to be an agreement that Israel will get 25 more F-35s and also KC-46 tankers. I mean, these are not needed to bomb Gaza. These are for Iran, you know, essentially from the Israeli point of view. And this goes along with, you may say, the movement of US forces to Southeast Asia to counter the Chinese. Israel may end up being the firm linchpin of US policy there. And Israel is now in the Central Command, which includes the Arab countries. And the best thing that hopefully, which will happen in the future, that there'll be more planning and regional defense against Iran, with the Israelis, you know, as an important partner with the US and the Arab states. You know, in terms of the Abraham Accords, Anthony Blinken, just a few days ago, also added his support to it and said there's more countries on the way. And actually the UAE and the Saudis are probably just as adamant as Israel about going back to the JCPOA. And in fact, the JCPOA was the trigger for the Abraham Accords. But besides that, you know, especially the UAE sees Israel as a success story, and they like to emulate it. And interesting, the UAE wants to modernize Islam. And, you know, they have their own issues between the religious and the more secular people. And they see Israel is juggling with the same issues. So it's another reason to get into accord. And in time, not anytime soon by any means, it may be the regional solution with the Palestinians may take place under the umbrella of the Abraham Accords. And finally, as part of what's going on, there's been some recent turmoil in Jordan. with the crown prince Hamza leading some sort of rebellion against King Abdullah. This seems to be resolved, but there's big issues in Jordan between COVID, increasing refugees from Syria, corruption. There is problems with the Palestinians, who make up 60% of the population of Jordan, and the Bedouin. For Israel, Jordan is strategic because Israel's longest border is with Jordan, and there's been very good security cooperation between the two countries. And for the U.S., the U.S. gets a good deal of intelligence and help from the Jordanians, particularly relating to Iraq and particularly Iraq, but also to Syria. And it's important for both the U.S. and Israel to have enough aid and shore up the Jordanian monarchy at this point. So what you see in the Middle East right now, there's a lot of moving parts. Essentially, as I said, you have the new Biden administration in the center, and surrounding them, you have what will come out of the elections in Israel, in Iran, and in the Palestinian Authority. And whatever happens, particularly over the next number of months, will determine what happens in the Middle East. And pretty well, whatever I spoke about today, given the Middle East, things can change dramatically by tomorrow. So I'm happy, if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer anything. Thank you. Anyone?
I've got a question.
Yeah.
So Eric, you were talking about the Palestinian election. Is it just for the Judea Samaria area and not Gaza?
Oh, it actually is Gaza and the West Bank. And, so a lot of votes Hamas will probably come from Gaza, but they also, because of the corruption, repression, the splintering of forces of Fatah in particularly the West Bank, the Israelis and now the US is nervous that this could be a repeat of 2006, where Hamas actually did gain control of the Palestinian parliament, which was essentially annulled after that. But if that happens, the US law and Israel would have a hard time dealing with the Palestinian Authority. So it's a crucial election. It may not, I think the Israel and the US is hoping it won't take place. Even some Palestinians and Fatah, our leadership, is saying that we should postpone the elections.
I thought that Hamas was not popular in Gaza, and that why would you assume that they're going to get a lot?
Because they have ways to find out who's going to vote.
So it wouldn't be a fair election.
No, it won't be a fair election. No one is really going to be overseeing Gaza, and so they're liable to get a fair amount of the votes one way or the other. I mean, it just came out recent. We were pushing the aid to prop up Abbas and hoping, okay, he'll win. But since then, now it looks like the U.S. is getting nervous and that the Fatah may screw it up again. So we'll see. It's coming up in about a month.
Couldn't that lead to a war if Hamas wins?
I think it'll end up probably leading to a cessation of U.S. aid. It'd be hard to carry out security cooperation. There'll probably be chaos for a period of time particularly in the West Bank. Will it impact on Israeli security? Yeah, to an extent. Will it put any attempt down the road on a two-state solution? it would be totally on the back burner at that point.
Would it also invite Iran into?
Yeah,
Yes.
it probably would. You know, Hamas gets a fair amount of their funding from, at least from Iran, so it's Islamic Jihad. You know, probably one of the important reasons that Jordan needs to be propped up, because the way Iranian supplies and military can get to the West Bank would be via Jordan. If that's diminished, then it becomes very problematic for Israel.
Hmm. Okay.
Any other questions?
Eric, I have one question.
Yeah.
Did you just say that the Israelis sent aid to Jordan?
Yeah, what they do is they give, they have agreements with water, and they've actually increased the amount of water recently they're giving to Jordan, as well as natural gas that they give to the Jordanians. One of the complicating features is there's not very good blood between Abdullah II of Jordan and Netanyahu. But that, you know, and that's manifested a few things recently, but the Israelis are keeping definitely their agreements and increasing the amount of water and natural gas. And, you know, the water is part of the peace agreement with the Jordanians from 1994, but the Israelis have recently increased the amount of water because of the droughts in the Middle East. And the natural gas, you know, that's a consequence of the recent finds and exploitation of the natural gas fields off the coast of Israel. And we've actually had, Israel actually has deals now with Egypt and Jordan to sell natural gas. And all these people are actually part of a consortium now of the Eastern Mediterranean, which is essentially against Turkey, Lebanon, and in part the Russians. So that's playing out at the same time. And actually, there was just a recent meeting between Cyprus, Israel, and Greece, and the UAE were just invited in terms of, you know, some sort of defense against Iran. So a lot of things, there's a lot of moving parts going on in the Middle East right now.
Thank you.
Eric, would you characterize the U.S. Biden sort of manner as being very cautious at this time and a wait and see, rather than, you know, lurching to the right or the left? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think so. You know, they're finding negotiations are probably even indirect hard in Vienna. There's a lot of pieces that have to be worked out. And the interesting thing is, I'm not so sure that the Biden administration would not favor Netanyahu to win, because Biden knows him for 30 years. You know, and, you know, Bennett, who could conceivably become prime minister, is more hawkish than Netanyahu. And the other one, Lapid or Gideon Sa'ar, are untested. And, you know, it may be the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. So I think they also see a Middle East with a lot of things happening in terms of China, Russia, the Iranians, the Palestinians, the Israelis. So I think they are being cautious. I do not think they're going to go into trying to have a peace agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis anytime soon. I think they want to, if there's any disagreements, they'd like to keep it not in public, you know, right now. And I think they're finding going back to the JCPOA harder than they may and than they probably anticipated. So I think, yeah, you're right. I think reality has a way of, pushing back at you, I think, once you're in power. So we'll see. Anyone else?
Eric, did
Yeah.
you? I'm sorry, I came in a little late, but what are the prospects of actually forming a coalition?
Truthfully, it's unclear right now. There's been extensive talks, particularly between Bennett and Netanyahu, but even then, that'll bring you to 59 votes. He needs 2 more. But the far-right religious party, what is it, Smotrich, does not want to sit with Ra'am and with Mansour Abbas, and he actually may favor what I've read, a more right-center coalition with the Arabs, not in the coalition, but at least supporting the more right-center party. So Netanyahu, I think he had 10 to 14 days or 12 days left. He could get an extension of 2 weeks, but it's unclear if he'll get it. And then it's also unclear if Rivlin will give the nod to whoever on the anti-Bibi forces, or just send it to the Knesset, where they have 21 days for somebody to put together a coalition. So, it's, as I said, it's like making sausage or doing a colonoscopy. You don't want to see how it's actually done. It's, whatever comes, it's at this point, I think it's unclear whether there will be, I think when it'll come down to the last few days before Netanyahu's mandate is going to expire, before you'll see if he has a realistic possibility. I think if he gets Bennett, he has to get 2 from probably Gideon Sa'ar's party, and promise them the world to get 61 votes. And it's unclear how things are going to work. I don't think anybody even the ultra-Orthodox parties are starting to get a little cold feet with Netanyahu. And, even though they've been in his camp for years, in the end, to forestall a 5th election, they could even, some have made some talk about joining a coalition with the anti-Bibis, but then again, Avigdor Lieberman, and even Lapid, especially Avigdor Lieberman, is very anti-ultra-Orthodox. So at this point, you can probably flip a coin and what's going to happen.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Ra'am? And
yeah, Ra'am is the Southern Islamic Party. The Northern Islamic Party was actually disbanded because they were very extreme. Even though the Southern Islamist Party, headed by Mansour Abbas, is an anti-Zionist party, he wants to be in a coalition to focus on Arab concerns, with housing, with violence, more monies to the Arab community. You might say he's the Arab equivalent to the ultra-Orthodox parties, But the main thing is, it was actually first Netanyahu who broached the idea, not the center parties or the left. So he may or may not be in any coalition, but going to the future, I think now this party, or somewhat, and Ra'am was a breakaway from 3 Arab parties. The other 2 are not joining any coalition. But, it may mean especially if there's a 5th election, everyone is going to be courting this particular Arab vote. And if they get more mandates, let's say in the 5th election, they could be the kingmaker on which government forms in Israel. But Israeli politics makes US politics look like child's play.
So Eric, has there been any thought about election reform in Israel?
Well, people would like it, but you know, the only way you can really get that would be for big votes for, say, 2 or 3 major parties, because the smaller parties, if they raise the election threshold, may be taking themselves out of business. So it's highly unlikely, at least right now, that there will be, even though it's badly needed, election reform probably is not on the cards right now. I mean, in the old days, you had, say, a couple of bigger parties that they're already starting with, say, 40, 50 votes. So it was easy to get a coalition. Now, you know, even Likud has what, 29 or 30. And, you know, so half the coalition has to be with smaller parties, and everybody has their demands and everybody has different agendas. It's much harder now than it was, say, 10, 15 years ago. But yeah, the system is basically broken. But it gives everybody, it's from one Zoom meeting, it does give everybody a voice in Israel, what they think is more important, which is a good thing. The bad thing, it's hard to get a government.
Right.
We'll see. But you'll know better in about 10 days.
I have another question.
Yeah, go ahead. Fine.
So you know, in the past, there was always the term apologist Jews, or
Yeah.
Jews who served in the, that's more apt to be the Democratic
yeah.
administration. They were real tough on Israel. And
Yeah.
Would you characterize the current Jews who are serving in the Biden administration in the foreign affairs area? Do they fit that category? Are they more centrist? Or, I mean, to me, they appear more centrist and not.
I think they're at least more centrist than say in the Obama administration. Part of it, the same people, but I think they have hindsight that certain things or certain assumptions didn't work out. And, you know, there are flaws in the JCPOA. I think they realized that the chances of even though they want to keep the idea of this 2-state solution on board, I think they realized that it probably not in the near future is that something that's realistic to expend political capital on. You know, they just actually, I think they're seeing that that as we pivot to Asia, the Abraham Accords is more important. And just recently, the administration said they're going to okay the arms deal that was made under the Trump administration as part of the Abraham Accords to the UAE. I mean, a lot of that equipment is not going to get there before 2025, 2026, but symbolically it's important. Right. You know, they're still holding up aid with the Saudis, but also, even though some progressives wanted to totally cut off the Saudis, I think the administration thinks that it's still too important a relationship. So you may give them a slap on the wrist or something, but it's not in U.S. interest to rupture the relationship. So I think, yeah, they're more centrist. You know, if very progressive is 1 and extremely hawkish is 10, they may be a 4 or something like that. Is the way I would, put that right now.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else?
What is the relationship these days with Hezbollah and Iran? Is it still like
Yeah,
considered? Yeah.
yeah, Hezbollah, and basically Hezbollah takes their orders from Iran, but the amount of aid because of the sanctions has diminished a good deal. Of course, they're trying to get more monies by various schemes, particularly in South America and in West Africa. And Lebanon itself is collapsing economically and politically, especially since the explosion at the Beirut port, which many think obvious that Hezbollah was in control of the port, and they probably knew what was going on. And my bet is their appetite for a war now with the Israelis is probably fairly low. I don't think they want anything, but if Iran gave the okay, they would have to make that big decision, because they has essentially been a branch of the Iranian proxies, and they also see that Israel has a great deal of intelligence about Iran. They've been training divisions specifically, further training for fighting in Lebanon and actually southern Syria. And Hezbollah took a tremendous number of casualties in fighting in Syria. So I don't think they have a great appetite for war, but if things heated up significantly with Iran, if Iran gave the order, they probably would have to do it. Things have been heating up with Israel and Iran recently, in the Red Sea, in strikes, obviously in Syria. A lot of things that have been happening at Natanz in 2020, where the part of the above ground facility was destroyed, the underground just recently, the assassination at Berizada. Israel has been at war with Iran. It's just a gray war, not that, it's not a full-fledged war, which probably both sides don't want right now. But, in the Middle East, any spark like in 2006 can set things off. One never knows, but we just have to see. It's probably more likely that Lebanon government and the economy may collapse first before there's any war in Lebanon.
So what are the repercussions of a Lebanese government collapse? I mean, that seems pretty ominous to Israel. I mean,
it is. I think Lebanon, Hezbollah is actually trying to bolster their social services, hoarding food, so they'll be able to at least support their supporters, which is mainly the Shiite community. The only other force that could bring any sort of stability may be the Lebanese armed forces, which we've been giving them monies and equipment. I mean, can they take on Hezbollah? The answer is no. But if Lebanon sort of collapses, and even if Hezbollah loses popularity, that may be the only force that has any stabilizing function in Lebanon. We'll just have to wait and see. But it's the situation in Lebanon is becoming worse daily. There's huge inflation. There's very little trade now that the Beirut port has been essentially destroyed. France and others who want to contribute say you have to reform the government first. It's Hezbollah basically has a veto on that. And so it's a total mess to go along with the messes in Syria and Iraq and in Yemen. It's all a mess.
Or
Basically, any place that Iran has touched has essentially fallen apart as a country when you look at it. Any other questions?
All right, if there's no more further questions, I want to thank everybody for attending. And I would also like to make a personal thank you for Eric for doing all the research and getting everything together to make this presentation today. It's very nice of you to do that, Eric.
Hey, thank you. But,
thank you.
Have to go,
Thank you very much, Eric.
Okay, you're welcome.
That's great.
It's
All
been
right.
fun. Okay,
Take
I'll
care.
see you. Take care. Bye now.